Today in our reading plan, we're on Romans chapter 9, and this is one of the most controversial and difficult chapters in the Bible. In fact, if you're new to reading the Bible, then these might be some new concepts in this chapter. So I just encourage you, read them. I'll put some links below on some other topics that might help you unpack some of this if you're interested in this right now. But Paul's talking about God choosing Israel, right? Remember, in the previous chapters, he's explained how Jews and Gentiles are alike sinners, and Jews and Gentiles are alike offered this free gift of salvation through Jesus Christ. And so the question then, if you're thinking about this as a Jew, is verse 6, well then, has God failed to fulfill his promise to Israel? Now you can go back and read Genesis 12 for more on the promise that Paul's talking about here. But it's basically a promise that the people of Israel, the Jewish nation, would be this specially selected, chosen nation above all other nations, right? And Paul's answer to this is no, he hasn't failed to fulfill his promise. For not all who are born into the nation of Israel are truly members of God's people. So again, what he's saying here is Gentiles, in essence, are the new Israel. Israel now is this expanded understanding of the people of God. It's not just the Jewish people, right, from the Old Testament, but it's everyone who has the faith of Abraham. That's what makes us a child of Abraham. Again, you can read that for yourself, but I'm going to scroll down. He says in verse 13, in the words of the scriptures, I loved Jacob, but I rejected Esau. And what he's talking about here is God's sovereign choice, God's ability to make a decision. You know, with these two twins, Jacob and Esau from the Old Testament, God chose the younger one to be the one through whom the blessing would come rather than the older one, which was not man's way. It was God's way. And God did all that because he could, because he's God, he's sovereign, right? And he says this in verse 16. So it is God who decides to show mercy, and we can neither choose it nor work for it. You know, Jacob wasn't any more worthy of it than Esau, but God gave him the blessing. And the point that Paul's making is this is how salvation works, right? You can't earn your way to salvation, being a Jew, right? Or being a really good person or keeping all the laws. You can't earn your way to salvation. This is a God thing. And the only way to salvation is by trusting in Jesus Christ for salvation, right? So he says in verse 19, well then, you might say, why does God blame people for not responding to this free gift of salvation? Haven't they simply done what he makes them do? And this is the idea of what we would call today Calvinism, right? This idea of sovereign choice, predestination. You know, this concept of maybe some people are predestined to be part of the people of God and other people are not predestined. Now, again, I'm not going to get into that right here, but I'll put some links below if you want to learn more about both Calvinism and the other side, Arminianism. And so you can study that on your own. But here's what Paul says in verse 20. He says, no, don't say that. Who are you, a mere human being, to argue with God? Should the thing that was created say to the one who created it, why have you made me like this? Right? And so Paul's whole thing, it's almost like he doesn't fully answer the question. He brings it to a different level. And he says this, well, what if God wanted to do that? Are you going to put yourself in the place of God and dare to tell him that he doesn't have the right to choose some and not to choose others, right? He says, God is God, you're not. That's kind of the sense that I get when I read this passage. Whether you're a Calvinist or Arminian, and again, you can read those more on those two choices in the links below. It doesn't even matter as much as just this attitude that we have when we approach God. And the attitude is, he is God, we are not. We need him. We desperately need him for our salvation. And so, this is not a work. We can't work ourselves. We can't work our way to God, right? And so Paul sort of summarizes this like this in verse 30. He says, what does all this mean? Even though the Gentiles were not trying to follow God's standards, they were made right with God. And it was by faith that this took place, right? So again, don't forget that this is really the broad point that Paul's trying to make here in all of these verses and all these chapters. He says, but the people of Israel who tried so hard to get right with God by keeping the law never succeeded, right? Go back to the law versus the Spirit. Why not? Verse 32, because they were trying to get right with God by keeping the law instead of by trusting in him. They stumbled over the great rock in their path, right? And so This is, again, what we talk about when we say that we're saved by faith, right? In Foundations, that first lesson in Foundations, if you haven't taken it, I encourage you to do that. That we start a relationship with God by trusting in Jesus. Jew, Gentile, good person, bad person, doesn't matter your pedigree, doesn't matter your background. That's what Paul's talking about. So you're ready to read chapter 9. It's a long one, and then we'll see you tomorrow for chapter 10.